What was the best you have no power here moment you have ever seen? Story 1. I used to work for a very unpleasant manager during my time at McDonald's. This guy was terrible to us, constantly bullying the team, bad-mouthing us to customers, and doing everything he could to make our work lives miserable. Thankfully, so many people complained about him that he eventually got fired. The new manager was fantastic, chill, understanding, and supportive of everyone. A couple of weeks after he took over, the old manager showed up at the store and started criticizing everything. He claimed the store looked awful, the service was worse than ever, and that the team needed him back. The new manager calmly looked at him and said, "If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." When the old manager refused to leave, the new manager kept his word and called the authorities. The result? The former manager is now banned from all McDonald's locations in the city and has a restraining order against him. Story 2. This might be a long one. I grew up with a mother who had dissociative disorder, narcissism, and an addiction to opioids that stretched as far back as I can remember. She would do anything to get her fix, and I mean anything. Growing up, it wasn't uncommon for her to throw tantrums during her highs, verbally tear me apart over things I was self-conscious about, sabotage my relationships with my father and siblings, or even physically harm me. She would stay awake for days, only to pass out standing up, her eyes glazed over and her posture hunched. When she'd awaken, she'd often destroy parts of the house in a frenzied state. At times, I'd leave home and return to find the place in complete disarray. Broken glass, animal waste, dirty laundry, pill bottles, and roaches everywhere. On the worst nights, she would hallucinate and injure herself, leaving pools of blood from running into broken glass. There were sleepless nights where my parents would scream at each other for hours, sometimes barging into my room at 4 a.m. to force me to witness their fights. They constantly tried to make me take sides. My mother would also manipulate and abandon me, leaving me stranded when meeting her various sugar daddies, while never once apologizing during moments of clarity. She blamed everyone else for her actions. We lived in constant poverty. She couldn't hold a job, and though she sold some pills, the money always went back into her addiction. We were often homeless, without power or water for years, and with barely any food. Many nights, the only meal I had was a school lunch, and weekends sometimes meant no food at all. My extended family was unaware of the severity of my situation. However, when I was 16, my aunt from Texas reached out, offering to let me visit her for a few weeks during the summer. I was ecstatic and didn't even bother asking my parents. I doubted they'd notice I was gone. When my aunt arrived, our house was relatively clean. However, by the time we returned from getting food, it was a disaster again. My aunt noticed the mess and, even more unsettling to her, my complete indifference. Without saying a word, I carefully stepped around the debris and started packing. On our way to Texas, she asked if I was safe at home. I said yes. It was all I'd ever known. But her concern grew, and she eventually asked me to move in with her. At first, I thought she was joking. But after experiencing the love and care in her household, I knew I had to leave. We decided I'd pursue emancipation. Sitting across from my parents and their lawyer in court was one of the hardest moments of my life. I explained the neglect, abuse, and longing for peace, while their lawyer accused me of being ungrateful and financially motivated. My parents, as expected, tried to break me with their yelling and insults. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly addressed the courtroom. If you're asking if I respect my parents, the answer is no. But it's not about money, it's about survival. My mother erupted, screaming and accusing me of lying, until the judge slammed his gavel and had her escorted out. The judge looked at me and said, "I'm sorry you've had to endure this. You deserve a normal life. You'll return to Texas with your aunt, and social workers will check in to ensure your well-being. Good luck." As the gavel struck, I finally broke down, releasing years of suppressed emotion. It's been 7 years since that day. I'm proud to say I've built a happy and stable life. I have a fulfilling career, great friends, and a wonderful girlfriend. Therapy has helped me overcome the trauma, and I no longer live in fear or despair. Story 3. A while back, I got a job at the local cinema as a popcorn monkey. Just something temporary while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. There was a supervisor there who had been working since the site opened, about 5 years prior. She had a terrible reputation, with countless complaints from staff about her behavior. Within my first week, I almost quit because of her attitude. One night, I was on closing duty and basically cleaned the entire front of house area by myself. I stopped to take a drink of water, and she marched up to me barking, "We don't pay you to stand around drinking, you know." I calmly responded that I was thirsty and needed a drink of water, adding that if she wanted to tell me I couldn't have a glass of water, she'd have to take it up with health and safety. She huffed about not having had a break all day, which I ignored because, frankly, that wasn't my problem. Her outburst was entirely unnecessary and honestly ridiculous. 2 weeks in, I was promoted to supervisor. Apparently, my ability to handle basic tasks made me a standout by their standards. Unfortunately, she was also promoted, becoming a floor manager. This meant she continued her power trips, lording it over everyone she could, including me. 4 weeks after that, I got promoted again to floor manager, making us equals. She could no longer boss me around, but she shifted tactics. Instead, she tried to assert her superiority by flaunting her knowledge of processes and where to find things. My response? With the sweetest tone I could muster, I'd say, "Oh, thank you. That's so helpful. You know so much because you've been here for 5 years, and I've only been here 6 weeks." Story 4. I work for a trampoline park franchise. At one point, I was tasked with running a sister location for about a year and a half before I moved back to take over the original one. When I returned, the place needed a lot of work, but 2 employees in particular stood out. These were teenage boys who had been fired or suspended multiple times for being lazy, rude, and disruptive. They should never have been hired in the first place. The problem was their helicopter moms who intimidated the previous manager into reversing any consequences. When I came back, I had a thorough talk with the leadership team to assess the staff. I found out who was causing problems, skipping shifts, texting on the job, and generally being unreliable. Within my first week, I fired about half a dozen employees, including those 2 boys. That night, their moms called my personal number, thanks to it being listed in our online scheduling tool. They screamed at me, demanding to know why I fired their sons, threatening lawsuits, arrest, and even accusing me of discrimination against their white middle-class kids. I calmly asked, "Is your son over 18? When they both said yes, I replied, "Then you're demanding I illegally release personal information about a former adult employee? Bye." And that was the end of that. Story 5. This story might be a bit silly, but it gave me a great sense of satisfaction. Due to a tough economy and some poor financial decisions, my parents moved into the spare room of the house my husband and I bought a year ago. Things are mostly smooth, though I'm not especially close to them for reasons I won't get into here. One evening I was out gardening. Since it's hot during the day, and we're lucky enough to have a street light that keeps our yard pretty well lit at night, I usually garden after sundown. As I worked, I thought the hose had gotten twisted because it kept getting stuck. This went on for a bit before I realized it wasn't stuck. It was being pulled. I looked into the dim area just past the streetlight's illumination and spotted my father crouched over, tugging at the hose. So naturally, I did the only reasonable thing. I sprayed him with water. He yelled and ran inside with me, chasing after him. Once inside, he turned to me with a smug look and said, "You can't get me now. I'm inside." Using that classic father-to-daughter, "don't you make a mess" tone, I readied my hose, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "It's my house." Then I let loose. He was drenched. Cleaning up the mess afterward was absolutely worth it for the look of pure panic in his eyes. Story 6. I had a brief stint as a private investigator specializing in services for public defenders. In one county, the sheriff's department had a reputation for conducting bogus traffic stops to justify vehicle searches. One particular deputy came up repeatedly in these cases. I was tasked with interviewing this deputy for a defense attorney. His reports were some of the worst I'd ever seen, full of grammar and spelling errors and often failing to state why the traffic stops happened in the first place. During the interview, a senior sheriff's representative was present to ensure deputies didn't say anything incriminating. I pulled out the deputy's report, which I had marked up with a red pen like an English teacher, and started the interview with, "I had some trouble understanding your report." I then went line by line, pointing out every error under the guise of clarifying. The deputy grew increasingly red-faced. When I pressed him on why he pulled over my client, he couldn't provide a clear answer. Meanwhile, the senior sheriff's rep, usually very vocal in protecting deputies, sat in silence. In the end, the charges against my client were dropped. Months later, I was driving through the area after a camping trip, obeying all traffic laws when I got pulled over. It was the same deputy. He immediately recognized me, stammered, and managed to say, it's almost dusk. Turn on your headlights. Then he bolted back to his vehicle and drove off before I even started my engine. Story 7. I used to work in management at a theater. If the concession stand was slammed, I'd step in to help whenever I could. One busy night, I was helping out when I saw a particularly rude man yelling at a 16-year-old girl working the register. He was upset about her being too slow and even suggested she quit because she clearly couldn't handle pushing buttons or scooping popcorn. It was disgusting to watch, and I felt awful for her. I stepped in and told him that, as part of our anti-harassment policy, our employees had the right to refuse service to customers who mistreated them. I acknowledged the long lines and suggested he apologize and move on. He was furious. He left half of his order on the counter and stormed off. Anticipating what would happen next, I returned to my usual post at the customer service kiosk. Sure enough, he showed up. The look on his face when he realized I was the manager was priceless. He didn't ask for a refund, so I assume he watched the movie, but without popcorn. Story 8. I worked for 8 years servicing communications equipment on site, and for 5 of those years I was the department manager. When oil was discovered in our area, the workload exploded. My team was pulling 12-plus hour days, 6 days a week, and we were barely keeping up while scrambling to hire new people. One day, the CEO texted me to say he had hired an assistant manager for me, a relief I desperately needed. I was filthy from my last job of the day, but swung by the store to pick him up and take him to one of our sites where he would be handling paperwork. The moment he got into my truck, he started bad-mouthing the department. He claimed everything we were doing was messed up and that the department manager, me, was a complete idiot. He even bragged that he'd have my job within a few months. I mostly stayed quiet, listening as he rattled off one incorrect claim after another. Whenever I politely corrected him, he either backtracked or insisted I had been trained wrong. When we got to the site, out in the middle of the West Texas desert, he complained about the layer of dust on everything and ordered me to clean up the site. As I sat down at my desk, he berated me for sitting instead of following his command. So I called a taxi, filled out a notice of termination, and handed it to him. He was stunned and protested that only the CEO could fire him. I responded, "And right?" He nodded sheepishly. I extended my hand and introduced myself. I can teach anyone how to service equipment, but I have no idea how to teach someone not to be an asshole. Story 9. When I was in high school, I worked weekends selling computers at a popular warehouse club. I got the job through a referral from a friend, and the store manager specifically told me my sole responsibility was selling computers. Nothing else. One of the shift managers, however, didn't like that. He insisted I spend half my shifts folding clothes, despite me reminding him of the store manager's instructions. This went on for weeks. One weekend, the store manager showed up while both the shift manager and I were working. He slapped a stack of green bar paper onto a shelf, pointed to some highlighted numbers, and said to the shift manager, "Do you see this? These are our average technology sales numbers when you're on shift. See this number here? This is our average technology sales when you're not. At this point, it would be more cost-effective to simply fire you. What do you think of that solution?" The shift manager stammered and stuttered like a kid caught bullying on the playground. Though he wasn't fired, the store manager made it clear that I was never to leave the technology department unless I was on break or there was a fire. The shift manager never bothered me again. Story 10. I started working for a welding company as an engineering manager. We were producing a complex weldment, a pressure tank used for bathrooms, for $4,900 per unit, even though our costs were $9,300. The owner had taken the bid to get in with a big company, believing we'd make it up in volume. Spoiler alert, we didn't. The buyer for the company was a nightmare, constantly yelling during phone calls. We eventually sent a letter saying we'd honor the last 5 tanks on the current purchase order at the original price, but after that, the price would increase to $10,000 per unit. The next day, the buyer drove down with her boss, demanding an explanation and threatening to pull the business. I calmly explained that we were losing $5,000 per tank and couldn't continue. She demanded evidence, which I had already prepared. I turned on the projector and walked her through the numbers. I concluded, "As you can see, we can't continue producing this part at such a huge loss. I don't think anyone can make it for the original price. So if you have to pull the business, we understand." Her boss immediately interrupted, tripping over himself to say they weren't pulling the contract. In fact, he thanked us for honoring the current purchase order. After that, I had far fewer run-ins with the buyer. Story 11. A few years ago, I was at a hardware store when a guy stopped me and asked if I was a painter. I looked down at my paint-splattered whites and replied, "Yeah, I do historical restoration work." He asked for my hourly rate, and when I told him, he immediately claimed I was too expensive and tried to cut my rate by 25%. I'd already given him my number, but he kept belittling me, saying I wasn't worth the rate I quoted. I explained that I had a full-time job and this would be in my off hours, so it had to be worth my time. He eventually let me leave the store, but later called me 3 or 4 times, hemming and hawing about whether to hire me. He bragged about owning multiple properties and insisted it could be a great gig for me if I lowered my price. Each time I told him, "That's fine. Don't use me if you're not comfortable with my rate." Eventually I recognized his number and stopped answering. This guy thought he had all the power and that I'd jump at the opportunity. Luckily, I didn't need the work and could afford to walk away. Looking back, I'm certain he would have nitpicked every detail and probably wouldn't have paid me in the end. His inability to grasp that I didn't need him was almost laughable. Story 12. Once I had a boss try to discipline me, 3 months after the fact, for supposedly being rude to her during a board meeting with several of the group's CEOs. As part of the process, we each had to write our version of events on the disciplinary form, which would then go to HR for review. She completed her section, and when it was my turn, I calmly wrote, "Manager continually pressured me into deleting files from our client management system prior to a regulatory audit, which violates the ethical code of our profession and is against my moral standards. I accept I was short with her, but she was attempting to force me into performing an illegal activity." I handed her the form and watched the color drain from her face as she read it. Unsurprisingly, I never heard from HR about the disciplinary action. A short while later, I bumped into one of the CEOs at a bar and casually mentioned the incident, explaining why I might have come across as frustrated during that meeting. Not long after, she was fired. Bye, Felicia. Story 13. I used to work in a cell phone store in the UK selling devices and service contracts. One day, a young man, probably around 19, came in with his much shorter, visibly frustrated dad. The son wanted to cancel his contract partway through, though I could tell from his tone that he already knew it wasn't possible. However, his dad wasn't taking his word for it and had dragged him into the store to sort it out. I explained to them that the contracts clearly state you can't cancel prematurely without paying off the remaining balance. That's when the dad went full boomer rage mode on me, spitting, yelling, and throwing insults as if that would magically change the terms. I waited for him to finish, then calmly repeated the policy. He snapped back with, "I'll report you for violating the Sale of Goods Act." Unlucky for him, I had that act memorized. After a few customers early in my career had tried to bluff their way into refunds with it, I'd made a point to study it. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Sure, go ahead, you can even use our phone." I pointed to the store phone next to him. The man froze, realizing he had no idea what he was talking about. After a moment of awkward silence, he stormed out, leaving his son behind to roll his eyes so far back he could have seen his own brain in embarrassment. Story 14. While working in customer service for a restaurant delivery service, similar to DoorDash, I once handled a complaint about hair in someone's food. The hair was conveniently sitting right on top of the food. I checked their account and noticed they had only one order on it, which was already suspicious. Then I searched their phone number and found multiple accounts tied to it, each with just 1 or 2 orders, and all of them included complaints about hair in their food. Even worse, they had reused the same photo from a previous complaint because they'd ordered the exact same meal. I denied the refund. The customer argued, threatened to stop using the service, and tried all the usual tactics before hanging up. Moments later, they called back and tried again. I got the support request, recognized them, and denied it again. They hung up and tried yet again, but this time my coworker got the call. I showed them my findings and they denied the refund as well. The next day, the customer called back, now outside the refund window, and demanded to speak to a supervisor. The supervisor reviewed the history and banned her from the service for repeated fraudulent refund requests. Story 15. I work in an NHS hospital where no one pays out of pocket for treatment. It's all covered through taxes. One day, a patient was added to our clinic who had paid a doctor privately at another hospital for surgery, but was now getting her follow-ups done for free on the NHS. Technically, this isn't allowed, but it does happen sometimes. These patients can be difficult. This woman's appointment was scheduled for 8:55 a.m. before the clinic officially started at 9 a.m. She was seen promptly when we clocked in, but was already being snooty about waiting 5 minutes, despite saving a fortune by using the NHS. Then, an actual NHS patient needed urgent attention and was seen ahead of her. That's when the woman lost it, shouting that she'd paid all this money and demanding immediate service. Our charge nurse calmly walked out and demanded to know, "Who took money from you? Point them out." The woman turned beet red, stammering that she'd paid the private hospital. The charge nurse replied, "Exactly. Your money is no good here. The doctor is being paid by taxpayers to see an emergency patient first. Kindly sit down and be quiet, or leave my department until you can behave civilly." The woman sat down and didn't utter another word. Story 16. I was working as a flight instructor at a small airport on a Saturday when a plane had an issue during takeoff, veering off the runway and cartwheeling. The airplane was totaled, but fortunately, the pilot was not seriously injured. My student, next in line for takeoff, called me as it happened. I grabbed the airport car, a ramp worker, and a radio to redirect inbound planes to the other runway since we had no control tower. The airport manager officially closed the affected runway while on his way to the site. About 30 minutes later, a swarm of Texas DPS officers arrived and decided they were going to shut down the entire airport, treating it as a giant crime scene. They recklessly drove around the airport, ignored moving planes, and even crossed the open runway without paying attention to inbound traffic. When the officers told me they were locking down the whole airport, I explained that only one runway was closed and that the airport was still operational. This didn't sit well with them. The airport manager, a former Navy guy, wasn't intimidated by their antics. One cop said to me, "You aren't going anywhere." The manager cut him off and said, "It's one runway that's closed. The airport is still open." The mechanic warned the officers to be careful driving around the runway, and when one angrily asked, "Why the hell is that?" the mechanic replied, "Because this is still an airport, and the first thing that hits you will be a propeller." Moments later, a plane took off right as a police car approached the runway intersection, driving the point home. When I climbed into the plane with my student, the same officer tried to stop me, saying, "You're not going anywhere. We're locking this down." The airport manager simply said, "Have a nice flight, Ajax BU." As we took off, I saw the officers fuming. They'd realized they didn't have the authority to shut down an entire airport just because one plane had a minor crash on a separate runway. Story 17. I was one of 2 mechanics performing an annual inspection on a Piper Arrow fixed-wing aircraft. Among various issues, the most significant problem was with the main landing gear motor. Federal law requires the down and lock cycle to take 30 seconds or less. This plane needed 3 to 5 cycles over 2 minutes to achieve lock. I told the owner, a notoriously sleazy lawyer, that the plane was not airworthy and I wouldn't sign off on the inspection until the landing gear was repaired. He insisted I sign off and fix the issue some other time. When I refused, he threatened my job and demanded his plane back to find another mechanic to sign it off. I laughed in his face, impounded the aircraft, and reported the issue to the FAA. The lawyer ended up abandoning the plane at my shop after racking up enormous hangar fees. Eventually, the title was transferred to the business I worked for as payment for those fees. Story 18. I worked as a salesman at a wire and cable company when a tow truck driver called Friday morning, panicking. He needed a replacement cable ASAP for his busiest weekend. He was rude and demanding, insisting the cable be custom cut, shipped next day air with Saturday delivery, an expensive request. I prioritized his order, rushed to the warehouse to ensure it jumped the queue, and got it shipped out in time. Everyone involved dropped what they were doing to make it happen. Later that afternoon, the driver called back, saying he fixed his truck and no longer needed the cable. He wanted to cancel the order and get a refund. I explained that because it was custom cut, a restocking fee would apply, and the shipping costs couldn't be refunded as the order had already shipped. The driver lost it, screaming and threatening to leave bad reviews and trash our company. I calmly explained that nothing could undo a custom cut and shipped order. His tantrum changed nothing, and he was stuck with the consequences of his own urgency. Story 19. I had an old boss who was an absolute nightmare. He was technically my boss's boss and wasn't supposed to interact with us directly, but he loved to micromanage and make everyone under him uncomfortable. T or he company had already sent him to training twice because of his inappropriate behavior. One evening, I got a call at home from him. He immediately started yelling, cursing, and insulting me over some technical issue he'd just discovered. After a couple of minutes of listening to his tirade, I looked at my phone and simply hung up. The next day, I was called into a meeting with his boss, who wanted to know who I thought I was for hanging up on him. I calmly explained, "No one gets to yell at me in my home, on my phone, and on my time. If he wants to yell at me, he can wait until I'm on the clock and getting paid for it. I'm more than happy to take that money." Story 20. I work at a high-end hotel where we usually go out of our way to appease guests. But when it comes to parking lot poachers, we don't hold back. If someone parks in our lot without permission, we boot their car. One day, a woman parked in our lot and walked over to a neighboring hotel. Our GM happened to be in the lot and politely told her, "This is parking for our hotel, not theirs." She flipped him off and said, "Watch on you," before heading inside the other hotel. The GM called me, and I happily grabbed a boot to slap on her car. When she came back and saw the boot, she went ballistic, screaming and ranting. I calmly told her the cost to remove it was $200. She called the police, who simply asked, "Is this a private lot?" When I confirmed it was, they told her to pay up. She stormed off instead. A little while later, I got a call from her mom, who tried to claim her daughter didn't know and was there for a job interview. After letting her go on, I finally said, "Your daughter flipped off our GM. The boot isn't coming off without payment, and if she comes in yelling or swearing, the price goes up to $300. The mom hung up, and the daughter eventually came back, silently handed me $200, and left with a look of pure rage. It was the most satisfying moment. Story 21. I was working a lab assistant shift, receiving specimens, when a doctor called, furious about how long a test was taking. He said it was for a fungal culture on a patient in the ER. I told him fungal cultures typically take at least 2 weeks because we have to wait for something to grow. He got huffy and demanded to know if there was a way to speed up the process since he wanted to discharge the patient. I chuckled a bit and explained, "We don't have magical wands to make fungi grow faster." Annoyed, he asked to speak to a lab tech. I politely informed him that I was a lab tech with experience in microbiology and assured him that fungal cultures are some of the slowest growing cultures, similar to AFBs. I promised him that if anything developed, we'd notify the ER immediately. Sometimes you just can't rush science. Or fungi. Story 22. My ex was a narcissist, and during our relationship, I had learned to walk on eggshells to maintain peace. We had 2 kids, and as a stay-at-home dad, I did over 90% of the parenting. One tactic I used with the kids was counting to 3 when they misbehaved. If they didn't stop, they'd go to timeout. Fast forward to our divorce. She manipulated the courts into granting her educational decision-making authority for our kids and enrolled them in a school far from me, but close to her. To spend more time with them, I started volunteering at their school. One day she called me, declaring that she had decided I could no longer volunteer. I told her she had no right to make that decision. She pulled out the educational decision-making card, but I calmly pointed out that it didn't extend to telling me what to do on my own time. She wasn't used to me standing my ground and began yelling. Without thinking, I said, "1." She paused, confused, but then started ranting again. I followed with, "2." At this point, she likely realized what I was doing. She paused, took a deep breath, and tried to speak more calmly, but it didn't last. When she started yelling again, I said, "3," and hung up. She called me back immediately, but I ignored her calls. 10 minutes later, I called her back. She didn't yell this time, and we had a more civil conversation. Of course, I continued volunteering at my kids' school, because I'm a good dad, damn it. Story 23. A few years ago, I responded to a call with my volunteer fire department. A vehicle had rolled over halfway between where I was and the fire hall, so I let the team know I'd meet them there. When I arrived, it was a single vehicle rollover involving several immigrants from the Pakistan-Afghanistan region. A doctor from a similar background had stopped to help before I got there, and I initially assumed she was one of the passengers. She immediately tried to take charge, saying things like, "She has midline neck pain and sore ribs." But when I asked for more details, like deformities or crepitus, she cut me off, insisting, "That's all you need to know." Confused, I asked, "What kind of doctor are you?" She replied that she was a podiatrist. I gave her my best polite but serious look and said, "Their feet are fine right now." In emergency situations, doctors or nurses can trump EMS, but they must take responsibility for patient care and sign off as having taken control. When I handed her the paperwork and suggested she ride with us to the hospital, she realized she was out of her depth and promptly disappeared. Story 24. I worked for a company for 12 years. About 18 months before I left, they cut staff and piled the senior engineer's workload onto me, in addition to my regular duties. After a year of this, I started discussing a promotion to reflect the increased responsibilities. Months passed with no progress, and in April, they gave me a measly 2% raise. Then they fired my boss, and I began reporting directly to the plant manager, the highest-ranking person in the building. I brought up my promotion again, but after 3 meetings where I was brushed off with, "I'll see what we can do," I started looking for opportunities elsewhere. It didn't take long to find an offer I couldn't refuse, a 25% plus raise for the same position just down the road. Still, I wanted to give my company one last chance to counter. When the plant manager refused to meet with me, I found him at the water cooler and said, "I want to hash this out today." His response, "I don't have time for you." So, right then and there, I told him I was leaving in 2 weeks and was on my way to HR to submit my notice. Dragging my enormous metaphorical balls around the rest of the day was no easy feat, but it was worth it. Story 25. Years ago, I worked security at a bar. One night, we had a fill-in DJ because our regular was out sick. This DJ was known for not handling his liquor well, so the bartenders were instructed not to serve him. Of course, some customers gave him shots, and by the end of the night, about 30 minutes before closing, he got mouthy on the mic, complaining about not being served. My manager warned us to be ready to throw him out, and even had a CD queued up to take over. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the DJ threw down the mic, breaking it, and started using his headphones as a makeshift microphone. Then he yelled, "And furniture security." That was the final straw. My fellow bouncer, a 6'2", 250-pound wall of muscle, stormed over, grabbed the DJ, 5'10", 170 pounds, around the shoulders and neck, and yanked him away from the turntables. The iconic needle screech followed as he was tossed out the front door. The DJ kept trying to come back in, claiming he needed his stuff, but we told him he'd get it when we said so. He started threatening me, claiming he knew the owner. I just nodded and said, "Okay, go get him." About 30 minutes later, the DJ returned with the owner, looking smug. But the owner stepped in, turned to the DJ, and unleashed an epic rant about disrespecting the bar and its staff. The DJ looked like he was about to cry. Years later, I still see that DJ around. He pretends it never happened, but every time he recognizes me, he says, "Oh, hey, you worked at bar name." I always reply, "Yeah, the one we threw you out of." I still don't like that guy. Story 26. Every word of this story is true. My younger sister and I have different dads. Her dad was an abusive alcoholic, and our mom left him at Christmas in 1981. By Christmas 1982, they were divorced, but he still wanted to see my sister. He showed up at my grandparents' house during our big Christmas Eve celebration. A word about my grandfather: he was a certified badass. A Purple Heart recipient in World War II, he also fought in Korea. Old school NRA and tough as nails. At some point, my sister's dad started drinking and told my mom, in front of everyone, that he was going to whip her ass and didn't care who was there. No one could stop him. The room went dead silent. My grandma tried to diffuse the tension by handing me another present to open, while my grandpa quietly walked out of the room. When he returned, he was holding his shotgun at waist level. He stared my sister's dad straight in the eyes and said, "The only reason I don't put this up your ass and pull the trigger is that my wife just redecorated this room." Pure Clint Eastwood energy. My sister's dad got up and walked out, never turning his back on my grandpa. He got in his car and drove away while my grandpa kept the gun trained on him. Once he was gone, my grandpa put the shotgun away and we enjoyed the rest of our Christmas Eve. I was 6 years old and that moment left a huge impression on me. Story 27. I went to a private Catholic all-boys school for a few years, and there was this one kid who was the epitome of a stereotypical bully. He could have walked straight out of a comic book. One day during gym, while my back was turned, he threw a basketball that hit me square in the small of my back. It hurt like hell, and I'd had enough. I knew starting a fight in front of a teacher might get me whooped, suspended, or even expelled, But I didn't care. I was furious. I walked straight up to him, and as he smirked at me, I punched him square in the jaw. He immediately cowered, covering his face. But I kept swinging, landing blows on any exposed part of his head until the PE coach pulled me off. The bully made a huge fuss, insisting he hadn't fought back and claiming I'd attacked him out of nowhere. His friends backed him up, grinning as the coach escorted me out of the gym. I thought I was screwed. The coach took me to the office, and I braced myself for punishment. But instead of suspension or detention, he handed me a stack of the school's daily announcements and told me to deliver them to each classroom. I was back in the gym before the end of the period. The look on the bully's face when he saw me was priceless. "Didn't they punish you? Aren't you suspended?" he asked, dumbfounded. With the biggest grin, I replied, "Yeah, they made me pass out the announcements. I really learned a lesson today." He never picked on me again. Unfortunately, he didn't stop bullying others, but that moment remains one of my favorite memories. Story 28. This didn't happen to me, but I got a front row seat. I have a coworker who's highly skilled and experienced in our hospitality company, which was massive. His expertise made him a sought-after team member, with executives and department heads constantly requesting his help on projects. When it came time for him to ask for a raise, our manager, director, and executive director turned him down and countered with an insultingly low offer. Feeling disrespected, he started looking for opportunities outside the company. Word got around, and soon the CFO and several senior VPs reached out to him, urging him to stay. They worked out a deal where he'd contribute to special projects across departments and offered him a significant compensation package. Out of respect, my coworker submitted a formal request to transfer, but it required approval from our current manager, director, and executive director. Predictably, they denied it. To make things worse, they even wrote him up for supposed attendance issues from months ago. Completely ridiculous, especially since we're salaried and project-based. Meanwhile, I was just a fly on the wall in our shared office, laughing with him as he took phone calls with the literal top brass of the company. The VPs and even the VP of Human Relations told him to ignore the nonsense, apologized, and launched an internal investigation into the 3 clowns who were blocking his transfer. The fallout was glorious. The investigation revealed serious issues with the way those 3 were handling employees, and the backlash they faced was massive. The cherry on top? After the dust settled, my coworker was promoted and became their boss. Watching them squirm was the ultimate payback. Story 29. When I worked for a private car park, there was a man who habitually parked in disabled bays, often taking up 2 spaces without displaying a blue badge. Every time he parked, we issued him a parking ticket, but he ignored them all. Eventually, the company took him to court and got a court-enforced ban for his vehicle. This meant he was prohibited from entering the car park, and if he stepped foot on the property, he could be arrested for trespassing. But he kept ignoring the ban. The police were often called, but he always managed to leave before they arrived. Frustrated, the company applied for permission to have his vehicle towed. We had a tow truck on standby just around the corner, waiting for his vehicle to ping the ANPR system. One day, ding! His number plate flagged up. I immediately texted the tow truck, and we waited for him to leave his car. The tow truck arrived quickly, deploying its crane and locking the wheels in seconds. As the car was being secured, the owner showed up. My manager and I calmly explained that his car was being towed for trespassing and abandonment. The police were en route, and the tow truck was already leaving with his car. He started yelling about how it was a public car park and threw around misinformation he'd gotten from Facebook about private parking companies being illegal. We handed him court documents outlining the ban, the unpaid tickets, and the legal authority behind our actions. When the police arrived, they served him with a county court judgment, CCJ, for over £7,000 in unpaid tickets and fees. He couldn't afford to reclaim his car due to the storage and recovery costs, so the company legally claimed the logbook and auctioned off his vehicle to recover the debt. The result? He lost his brand new car, received a CCJ that wrecked his credit score for the next 10 years, and was arrested for trespassing, all because he believed, "Facebook told me I can do what I want." Story 30. A few years ago, I interviewed for a senior level position in my field. I went through 2 phone interviews and an in-person interview, all of which went exceptionally well. Shortly after the in-person interview, they called to tell me how much they loved me and how I'd be a great fit for the company. But then they said they felt I was a little too green for the senior level role and offered me a junior level position instead, with a significant salary decrease. I politely but firmly explained that I had applied for the senior level position because I was qualified for it, and that taking a junior role would be a step backward in my career. I added that stringing along someone with senior level experience only to offer them a junior role was both deceptive and unethical. The interviewer went silent for a moment before replying in an offended tone. Well, we've all had to make sacrifices for company name. I shot back. You may have had to, but I don't make sacrifices for anyone. Cue stunned silence. The interviewer, clearly at a loss, stammered. Well, maybe you can think about it, and I'll call you tomorrow to check in. I ended the conversation with, no thank you, and please don't call me, before hanging up. This kind of manipulation happens far too often, especially to young women in various industries. My advice? Know your worth. Stand by your qualifications and never let anyone devalue your experience. There are employers out there who will appreciate and pay for your talents. Don't settle for less. Story 31. The day after we closed on our first house, we stopped by to start moving some things in. When we pulled up, we saw the previous owner digging up plants in the front yard. The back of her truck was packed with all the plants and landscaping she had removed. It was a corner lot with garden beds on two sides of the house. When we asked her what she was doing, she casually replied that she had planted them to make the house look better for the sale and wanted to take them for her new house so she wouldn't have to buy more. We called the cops. They gave her a choice: replant every single plant exactly as they were or face arrest. She spent over 5 hours putting everything back while we watched. Once she finished, the police inspected her work and warned her that if she ever stepped foot on the property again, she would be arrested. We never saw her again. However, a few days later, we found her weed stash hidden on top of the kitchen cabinets. Story 32. When I was 17, I worked at a community pharmacy where we knew most of the locals. One day, an elderly lady came in acting suspicious, avoiding people, walking around nervously, and generally being terse with the employees. I saw her grab a couple of bottles of Robitussin and put them in her purse. I approached her and said, "Ma'am, I need you to put that back or pay for it. And if you're planning to sell or use it to make something, it doesn't even have the right ingredients." This was in Clarksdale, Mississippi, an area notorious for drug abuse. She screamed at me, accusing me of abusing her and being racist. Then she said, "I'm good friends with the owner, and when he hears how you've treated me, you'll be out of a job." I calmly replied, "Ma'am, the owner is here today." She stormed to the back of the store shouting, "Where is Eric? This young man is abusing me." The owner, hearing the commotion, came out and asked what was going on. She told him I had accused her of stealing. Eric looked at me, then at her, and asked, "Did you take anything?" She said, "Mr. Eric, I've known you since I moved here 4 years ago. I don't like this little boy you have working here. His mama didn't teach him how to treat a lady." Eric calmly replied, "I think she did a fine job. She's my wife. Let me see your bag." Story 33. At my previous job, one of the managers, who didn't oversee me directly, lived on the same street as I did. When she found out, she started pressuring me to visit her. After running out of excuses, I reluctantly went to her house. During my visit, she asked intrusive questions about why I was renting a house alone, what caste my roommate was, and told me not to live with lower caste people. She was also trying to figure out my caste. I hated her, but I couldn't report her as HR didn't even take serious complaints like sexual harassment seriously, let alone caste discrimination. To make matters worse, my landlord was friends with her and had given her a spare key to my apartment since they lived abroad. I knew if she found out I was in a relationship with someone from a different caste, she could tell my landlord and I'd risk being evicted. A few months later, I found a better job and gave notice. I was also getting married and moving out of that house. On my last day at work, I handed out wedding invitations to everyone, as it's disrespectful in our culture not to invite people you know, even if they can't attend. When I reached my manager's desk, the intrusive woman was smiling, clearly expecting an invitation. I handed one to my manager, smiled at her, and walked away without giving her one. I also ignored my landlord's request to mail her an invitation. After I moved out, she called to ask where it was, and I simply told her I forgot and didn't have any left. Neither of them held any power over me anymore, and it felt amazing to walk away without giving them the respect they didn't deserve. Story 34. In college, I worked for a small catering company run by a guy not much older than us. He was in his early 30s, tops. Our crew was mostly college age, so we looked young. One day, we catered an outdoor black tie wedding reception for over 300 guests in brutal heat. The bride's family, who funded the event, was exceptionally rude and demanding, making an already exhausting day even worse. Among them, the bride's aunt stood out as the absolute worst, entitled, obnoxious, and constantly pulling the "I'm family, so I should get special treatment" card. I was working the main bar alongside the company owner, who was also bartending. The aunt joined our line, loudly complaining about how long it was taking and saying she shouldn't have to wait because she was the bride's aunt. When she finally reached the front, she insulted him, saying he was slow and ineffective. Through gritted teeth, he handed her drink and said, "Here you go. Have a nice evening." That wasn't enough for her. She launched into a tirade declaring, "You're all just a bunch of dumbass kids. Don't you have any adults working this wedding? I want to talk to your manager or the owner, someone competent who can get the job done right." Without missing a beat, the owner's face broke into a massive sheeting grin as he replied, "Hi, my name is his name, and I am the owner of this catering company. If you'd like me to leave, there will be no food, beverages, or bar service at this reception." The verbal mic drop was so satisfying, it felt like a hype crew should have descended from the heavens, shouting, "Oh!" The aunt was stunned into silence and didn't bother us again for the rest of the night. Story 35. A few years ago, I was helping my parents move locally. My dad, being particular, reserved a U-Haul truck for 24 hours since we'd need to make multiple trips across a large metro area. When I went to pick up the truck, the paperwork said we only had it for a little over 3 hours. We were 35 minutes late to pick it up, but with a 24-hour rental, that wouldn't have mattered. I told the employee behind the desk this was supposed to be a 24-hour rental, but he insisted it wasn't in the system and said the truck was already reserved for another customer after us. The owner came over and started chastising me, claiming we must have made the reservation wrong. He questioned why we were late and berated us for needing more time. My dad walked in to check on the delay and got the same condescending attitude, which infuriated me. Finally, the owner said he'd check the call recording to prove who was right. I trusted my dad completely and agreed to wait. The owner, smug as ever, boasted, "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I don't make mistakes." 5 minutes later, after reviewing the call, he came back looking utterly defeated. On the recording, you could clearly hear my dad repeatedly confirming a 24-hour rental with the owner himself. Instead of apologizing, the owner guilt-tripped us, asking if we could return the truck early to avoid disrupting another customer's move. No acknowledgement of his mistake, no apology, just more attitude. Afterward, I left detailed reviews on multiple platforms and emailed U-Haul Corporate about the experience. Those reviews are now my most helpful posts on every platform they're on. I doubt he's forgotten about it either. Story 36. A couple of days ago, I saw one of my old water polo coaches at the pool where I work as a lifeguard. This coach was known for being an asshole, often favoring players from a specific high school because he coached there too. Since I had to stay until the facility closed, I decided to watch his practice after my shift ended. He seemed annoyed that I was standing there watching, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. He told me to leave and that everything was fine now. I politely explained that I was just observing. He got more agitated and demanded I go away. I told him I worked there, it wasn't his pool, and I could stand wherever I wanted. Frustrated, he asked to speak with my manager. Coincidentally, my manager also disliked him, so the coach got a proper talking to. The rest of the night, he kept giving me dirty looks. I can't wait for more night shifts where I might run into him again. It's going to be entertaining. Story 37. I'm a college professor in the U.S., and my favorite "you have no power" moments involve FERPA, a federal regulation that protects the privacy of college students. Under FERPA, I legally cannot discuss a student's progress with anyone, including their parents, unless the student has signed a waiver, which rarely happens. Every year, I deal with at least one Karen or Ken parent who tries to demand information about their kid's grades or progress. When they do, I simply reply, "I'm sorry, but according to FERPA, I am legally not allowed to discuss these student names' work with you. However, I'd be happy to speak directly to them if they have any concerns." Some parents even try to go over my head, but FERPA is a federal law. There's no way around it without the student's explicit permission. Watching these entitled parents rage against an immovable wall is deeply satisfying. Story 38. During university, I worked as a supervisor for the evening shift at a drugstore. After 5 p.m., I had acting manager powers since all the real managers went home. One night around 9:30 p.m., I was covering the register while a cashier finished her shift paperwork. A woman spent about 20 minutes browsing the clearance aisle, eventually bringing her items to the counter at 9:45 p.m. Among her purchases were 2 water bottles, a Paw Patrol one marked down to $1, originally $6, and a no-name brand bottle marked down to 50 cents. As I rang her up, she pointed to the water bottles and said, excuse me? This one is more expensive than the other one. Her comment broke me for a moment. It was like encountering a bugged NPC in a video game. Yes, different items cost different amounts. That's how pricing works. She elaborated, they were on the same shelf. They should be the same price. I explained that clearance items were individually marked with stickers, and the price on the sticker was final. She demanded to see the sign. Since I couldn't leave the till unattended, company policy for 24-hour stores, I suggested she bring the sign over and I'd walk her through it. She didn't care and insisted I mark the Paw Patrol bottle down to 50 cents, saving her a whopping 50 cents. I refused. She demanded to speak to a manager. With 2 minutes left in my shift, I leaned over the counter, clasped my hands and said, "Hi, I'm the manager. How can I help you?" Defeated, she paid the full price for her items and left. I never saw her again. Story 39. During college, I worked retail, usually doing stock and warehouse work, but occasionally running the register during busy times. One day, I was covering a surge at the checkout. After finishing with a customer who had a bunch of cat food cans, I put up the chain to close my lane, turned off the register light, and prepared to head back to the warehouse to relieve someone for their break. There were 3 other cashiers still working. As I was finishing up, this Sam Elliott wannabe-looking guy walked up, unhooked the chain without asking, and dumped his items on the counter. He didn't even make eye contact or acknowledge me. If he had just asked politely, I would have helped him. But his complete disregard for basic courtesy rubbed me the wrong way, especially since I was heading back to college soon and had no reason to put up with unnecessary rudeness. So I finished ringing up the cat food customer, walked away, and casually said over my shoulder, "Hey, can you put the chain back up on your way out?" It felt great to not cater to someone who treated me like I wasn't there. People who work service jobs know all too well how exhausting it is to deal with entitled customers. Story 40. My mom had a childhood best friend who was petty, intrusive, and treated her daughter, my age, like a baby. In turn, the daughter acted like one. Meanwhile, my mom and I were dirt poor, and I had to grow up fast. When I was 16, I had been working full-time at an ice cream shop for 2 years because my mom struggled to keep a job. One Friday night, I came home around midnight, exhausted. We had an agreement that she would do my laundry since I worked early on Saturdays and needed my uniform. But when I got home, the laundry wasn't done. I texted her, cranky and tired, to remind her. She apologized and said her best friend had surprised her and they'd gone out for drinks. I let it slide because she didn't get out much. Then I got a text from her saying, "You need to learn to do your own laundry and grow up." Confused and pissed, I replied, "Mom, are you drunk?" She called me, apologized, and explained that her friend had sent the text. I told her to hand the phone over. Her friend took it, and before she could even speak, I unleashed the most ice-cold fury I could muster. "You are not my mother. I am not your pathetic, lazy-ass daughter. I pay the rent in this house, and I'm pretty sure I also paid for the drinks you're enjoying. So kindly take your nose and shove it up someone else's ass. If you ever pretend to be my mother again, this conversation will feel mild in comparison." Then I hung up. I apologized to my mom for probably ruining her night, but I wasn't about to let that slide. Some lines you just don't cross. Story 41. In 2018, I took a new job close to home with a hefty pay cut. After just 1 week, I realized the place was a nightmare and immediately started job hunting again. I was running out of money, rent was becoming an issue, and I felt stuck. I soon learned the job had been advertised for months. Turns out I was the sucker who didn't realize how awful it was. I was hired as an assistant manager to help turn around a failing department, but the manager disappeared one day, leaving everything to me. All the responsibilities fell into my lap while I was still being paid peanuts. Knowing they couldn't quickly replace me and that they were panicking about having no one to manage the network, I demanded a pay raise. That board meeting was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. They were selfish, greedy, and neglectful of the business, and I had them completely cornered. They reluctantly gave me a substantial raise, and their reactions were priceless. I worked at the higher salary for 8 months before quitting, because the place remained a dumpster fire and my tolerance had run out. I'll likely never be in such a perfect position of leverage again, but it felt amazing. Story 42. At a convenience store, a lady threw a massive fit because the POS system required her ID to be scanned to buy cigarettes. She refused, screaming that she was clearly old enough and didn't need to provide ID. The clerk calmly said, "All right, have a nice day then. I can help the next customer over here." Then with a cheerful smile added, "Ma'am, you're going to have to scooch over a bit so I can help these customers. Thanks." This infuriated the woman, and she started screaming even louder. The manager came out trying to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop. Eventually the manager said, "Sorry, but we don't serve children unless accompanied by an adult. You need to leave my store before I call the cops." The lady shouted, "I am a cop, you idiot." The manager, unfazed, replied, "Yeah, cops get arrested all the time. You're not a special case." The woman stared at the manager for a full 10 seconds, seemingly ready to fight, but eventually deflated and left the store. Story 43. We were preparing for our yearly audit, and when the auditor showed up, she was wearing high heels. We're an industrial machine shop with a strict PPE policy requiring steel-toe boots. If visitors don't have them, we provide bright yellow steel boot covers, affectionately called clackets, because they make a clacking sound like a horse's hooves. Our greeter exchanged pleasantries with the auditor, asked if she had steel-toe shoes to change into, and when she said no, handed her the clackets. The auditor was clearly offended and got huffy about it. The greeter responded calmly, "You're here to audit us on our policies and procedures. The safety of everyone in the shop is our top priority. I cannot allow you to enter the facility if you cannot follow our safety policy." The audit was canceled and rescheduled, and we all had a good laugh about someone showing up to a machine shop in high heels for an audit. Safe to say she didn't make that mistake again. Story 44. After discovering that my dad had kept a secret child from me for 14 years, I was furious. When his mistress revealed the truth to his girlfriend, our relationship crumbled, and we didn't speak for years. Eventually, we started talking again, though my respect for him was already shattered. A few months later, my dad, granddad, and I went out for drinks. My dad's behavior made my granddad uncomfortable, so he left, leaving just the two of us. We ended up on a pub crawl, and things were fun until my dad started hitting on women and acting cocky. As we walked down the street, both drunk, he boasted, "You know, son, I've probably got 4 or 5 more brothers or sisters you don't know about." Shocked, I sarcastically replied, "Well, at least I know about Jessica, and that's enough for me." He didn't like that. He stormed into a takeaway and started shouting nonsense while buying food. He continued belittling my mom and stepdad, spewing vile comments. I snapped and told him, "You're sitting here calling everyone I care about horrible things when you're the one everyone left. You even have a restraining order against you, so you'll never meet Jessica. I'm done listening to this." He got aggressive, shouting and trying to drag me out of the takeaway. I asked the staff to call the police, and he turned his abuse toward them, yelling racist slurs. I laughed in his face, looked him in the eye, and told him, "You're not fit to be a father. You never treated me like a son, just some friend you met up with every few months. I never want to see the shell of a man you've become again." He left and started causing chaos in the street. The takeaway staff let me stay until I felt safe to leave. 9 months later, I'm almost 19, surrounded by a loving family and still in touch with my grandparents and aunties. I haven't heard from my dad since, but I'm hopeful to meet my sister someday.